Okay, so in the last lecture, we introduced this question of, is there a duty to obey the law? Do we have any duty to do something just because the law tells us we have to do it, or not to do it just because the law tells us not to do it? A lot of people think that we do. I haven't polled you guys on this, but when I've talked about this in classes in the past, the default opinion seems to basically be, and not everybody believes this, but a majority of people generally believe that we do in fact have some duty to do what the law tells us to do. Thoreau gives a challenge to that. Thoreau does not think that we have any duty to do what the law tells us to do simply because the law tells us to do it. In fact, Thoreau goes a step further. Thoreau thinks that we actually have a duty to break the law in a lot of cases. So let's dive into Thoreau's work on civil disobedience. So look, the term anarchist or anarchism is tossed around a lot. And there are a lot of things you might mean by the term. There's a lot of things different people mean when they describe others as anarchists or even describe themselves as anarchists. The strongest sense of this is that you might think that the government is in some sense bad, that the government creates more evil than it prevents. Maybe by a really long shot. It's not clear that Thoreau thinks this. In other works, he seems to be a little more accepting of the government. In the civil disobedience essay, he often does come pretty close to this idea that the government's more evil than not, that it does more harm than it prevents. I'm not sure if he thinks this or not. But you might also mean by anarchism that there's no duty to obey the law. One sense of anarchism would be if you think you have a good moral reason to break the law, you should break the law. Thoreau is very clearly an anarchist in this sense. He pretty clearly thinks that there's no duty to obey the law simply because it's the law. In fact, he will say there's a moral duty to disobey the law when you judge the law to be morally wrong. It's not just that you have a duty, that you don't have a duty to obey the law. Thoreau will say, when you think the law is morally wrong, even if you might be punished, even if it might be inconvenient for you, you have a duty to break the law. In fact, that's what Thoreau takes himself to have done, to break a law because he finds it unjust. Now look, to explain all this, we have to get a bit into the background of the essay. I won't bore you guys with too much of a history lesson, but I do think we need to understand what's going on here. This was written, and Thoreau was jailed during the Mexican-American War. Thoreau refused to pay his taxes, was called a poll tax. Again, that's a term people use to mean a lot of different things. Basically, this is just a flat sum of money everybody had to pay in the town that he lived in. So, Mexican-American War was going on. Thoreau thought that his tax money in some way went to pay for the war. We'll talk about this in a second. He might not have been right about this. So he refused to pay his taxes. So the sheriff of the town put him in jail. Thoreau did not stay in jail very long. Someone, the consensus seems to be probably his aunt, paid the tax. Thoreau was released. He was not too happy about being released. He was trying to make a point by not paying this tax. Anyway, why was Thoreau so mad about the war? Why did he think it was immoral? Well, for two reasons. And I honestly think he's right about both of these. Uh, One of these days, I'm probably going to have a proud Texan in my class who's going to be mad at me for saying this, but I tend to think Thoreau was right, right? Two reasons that he thought that the war was immoral. One, there weren't really good reasons for the war. The U.S. wanted to annex Texas. We knew we couldn't do it without a war. We basically did everything we could to pick a fight with Mexico. We sent troops in, very provocatively trying to pick a clash with the Mexican forces. Finally, it happened. We used that reason and went to war. We desperately tried to pick a fight. Finally, it worked. We go to war, right? Thoreau very sensibly thought you shouldn't go to war when you can avoid it. And you definitely shouldn't be trying to start a war when you can avoid it, right? Perhaps more importantly, though, was that Thoreau knew if Texas was annexed into the U.S., if it entered the Union, it would be a slave state, right? This would increase the power of slave states in the Union. Thoreau was a hardcore abolitionist. He thought, and I think rightly, that this would be a terrible thing, right? So, no good grounds for the war. War is likely to have terrible effects, so Thoreau does not in any way want to support it. In fact, Thoreau is going to not pay his taxes as a form of protest against the war. Now, as a historical aside, the tax Thoreau didn't pay probably didn't really go to support the war. You could still defend him and say, well, look, he's breaking the law as a way of drawing attention to this issue. So why did Thoreau do this? That's what I think is interesting here. And this is where I think Thoreau has a challenge for us. Thoreau says, how can you give your moral judgment to the state? All you people, he was in Massachusetts. Not many people there were in favor of this war. Even fewer people were in favor of slavery in any form. Thoreau would say, well, look, you guys, you're all against the war. You're all against slavery. But, you do what the law tells you. If they send the militia to go fight this war, you go fight. If the South sends the slave catchers up here, you grumble, but you don't stop these people, right? And you say, well, I know the war is wrong. I know slavery's wrong. But the law says we have to do this, so I'm not going to do anything about it. I'm going to defer to the law, even though I know it's wrong. And Thoreau says, how lazy is that, right? Your most important responsibility as a person is the moral judgments you make. To make up your own mind about what's right and wrong. How in the world can you just hand that off to the state? Well, I think this is wrong, but the state of Massachusetts or the U.S. government, the U.S. is a state in the larger sense, state being sort of any government. How can you just give it over to the government to make moral decisions for you? You think these things are wrong, but you just shrug and say, well, the government says otherwise. Who am I to feud with the government, right? And so Thoreau would say, well, look, can you imagine giving up your moral judgment to anyone else in any other case? If you were working for a company and, they wanted to do something horrible, right? Maybe you guys have heard of Ford in the Pinto case. Ford knew that if the Pinto was hit, the Pinto was this car, they knew if it was hit in a rear end collision, not even a very hard one, that it pretty often burst into flames and killed everybody inside. But, Ford Motor Company decided, well, it's cheaper to settle with the people who are burned horribly or the families of the people who are burned to death than it is to recall the cars and do this repair, right? If you worked for Ford Motor Company and you knew this was going on, if you were an engineer or whoever, you wouldn't just say to yourself, oh, well, I think letting innocent people burn to death is a really bad thing, but you know what? The boss says we should be okay with it, so I'm not going to do anything, right? If somebody thought in those terms, if you knew somebody could have brought this to light, how horribly unsafe this car was, and they just said, well, I thought it was wrong, but the company said it was okay, so I just, who am I to say the company said it was fine, so who am I to override the company, right? You would think anybody who thought that was a terrible, terrible person. Even if you work for the Ford Motor Company, you shouldn't give your moral judgment to the company, right? Well, Thoreau would say, how's it any different to give your moral judgment to the government? Slavery, the war with Mexico are both terribly wrong, but you just shrug your shoulders and grumble about them. You don't do anything. Not only should you not just surrender to the government, Thoreau would say, you have a duty to do something about the government having laws that are wrong. In the same way that, say, an engineer, whoever for Ford, who knew that the Pinto was horribly unsafe and was killing people, would have a duty to blow the whistle and let this be known, even if he gets fired. If you think the government's laws are horribly immoral, horribly unjust, you have a duty to do something, even if they might throw you in jail. Thoreau would say, I've actually just done what any decent person should do. I've taken a stand, even if the government might throw me in jail for it. So I think there's a really strong punch to Thoreau's ideas, right? Now, I mean, look, there are people today who do what Thoreau did, and a lot of times we act like they're crazy, right? I have a lot of relatives who are Mennonites. My family wasn't, my immediate family weren't Mennonites. But, a lot of our Mennonite relatives would subscribe us to their newsletters. If you guys don't know anything about the Mennonites, religious denomination, very, very strongly pacifist. They think war is completely morally wrong in pretty much all cases. And some Mennonites would actually, a lot of them run their own businesses. They're kind of related to the Amish Mennonite blur together, but a lot of Mennonites run their own businesses, and some of them, if you run your own business, you're kind of responsible for paying your taxes. Well, a lot of Mennonites who own their own business, what they will do, since they think war is immoral, they will figure out, not most, but some Mennonites will do this, they will figure out exactly how much of their federal income tax would go to the military. I forget what percent it is, but they will pay the rest besides that, right? If 20% goes to the military, I'm only going to pay you 80% of my taxes because I'm a pacifist. I think it would be wrong to finance the military. Now look, you guys might think the Mennonites are crazy, at least the ones who do this, which again is a minority of the Mennonites. Most pay their taxes even if they think it's wrong. But what's so wrong about this, right? Look, you might not be a pacifist, you might not think war is wrong, but if somebody is really convinced that war is wrong, Well, shouldn't they take responsibility and not pay in to support this, right? I'm not going to put words in your mouth. You can probably think of something the government does that you think is wrong, be you a liberal, a conservative, or a moderate. If that's the case, how can you just sit back and pay in and support this thing? Shouldn't you take responsibility and oppose it? Are people like Thoreau and these Mennonites in the newsletters who don't want to pay for the military because they think war is morally wrong, are they really so weird? Or are they, as Thoreau would say, just doing what any person ought to and taking responsibility for their own moral judgments? Look, we'll talk about an argument against Thoreau in the next series of slides, but I just want you guys to see the real punch of Thoreau's argument. So here's the actual, Thoreau never quite gives this, but here's, I think, a sort of distilled premises and conclusion argument for Thoreau's position. Premise 1, human beings are free, that is, autonomous beings. Free, autonomous in this sense that Kantianism has in mind. That is, we can decide what are good reasons for us and not. So, part of this, premise 2 would say, we are responsible for making up our own minds about moral questions. Premise 3, moral premise I think everyone would accept, it is wrong to fail to live up to our responsibilities. Premise 4, allowing the government, be it the federal government, state government, whatever, to make moral decisions for us fails to live up to our responsibilities. So it is wrong to simply give any moral decision to the government. We have to make up our own minds. If we think the government is wrong, Thoreau would say we should break the law because we judge it to be wrong. So Thoreau says not just no duty to obey the law, we have a duty to break laws that we find morally bad. Look, you have a duty to do the stuff the law tells you to do or not to do when there's a good moral reason not to do it, right? Laws against murder and rape and whatever, don't do that. You have moral reasons not to do that anyway. But if there's a law in support of slavery, or there's a law requiring you to pay in for a war you find unjust, not only do you have no duty to do that, you actually, Thoreau would say, have a duty to break the law and face the consequences. So, Thoreau takes a very strong position, not just no duty to obey the law, in fact, a duty to break the law when we find it morally wrong. Next lecture, we're going to look at a position, an argument, actually the next few lectures, that argue Thoreau is wrong about this, that there is some duty to follow the law even when we find it wrong, but I just want you guys to see the punch of Thoreau's position. It sounds crazy when you first hear it. Even if you ultimately don't agree with it, I hope you can see it's not crazy.